This is Gary Stieber with a message from Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 1 through 13. Jeremiah asked God a question that's troubled a lot of people for a lot of years. Why do the wicked prosper and live comfortable lives? Jeremiah knows that God is righteous and just, and he trusts him as his Lord, but this doesn't seem fair or proper to him. Have you ever had that thought? Many people have. God's reply is challenging for Jeremiah, and it may be challenging for you as well. Now, before we begin, I'd like to remind you that if you follow the Explore the Bible study schedule, like we do, we give away our study materials for free with no obligation. We publish every week, 7 to 10 days prior to the lesson's scheduled date, and if you'd like to get the complete study notes along with the presentation to use as your needs require, click on the link in the description below and give us the email address that you'd like to have notified. Each week we'll send you the link to the church website where you can download the materials. Now let's begin by setting a little context, as we always do. In chapter 11, God announces that the covenant that he had with his chosen people has been broken. And there's a point to be made here. We don't obey God to try to get him to bless us in the days ahead. We're to obey him from the outflow of the grateful heart for all that he's already done for us, whether he chooses to bless us with one more thing ever again or not. But not so the Israelites in the time of Jeremiah. He announces through Jeremiah, "Cursed be the man who does not hear," and hear means to follow as well, "the words of this covenant." That's in chapter 11, verse 2. And after God announcing that the covenant has been broken, in verse 5, Jeremiah replies, "Amen, Lord," saying in effect, "So be it." And the Lord would go on to say that the people don't listen, they don't pay attention, and they follow the stubbornness of their evil heart. That's in chapter 11, verse 8. Now, isn't that a message that we often hear in our own day? That you should follow your heart. Well, it may be said differently, like to follow your passion or to follow your desires, but it's the same thing. The Bible never tells us to follow our heart. It teaches us to die to ourselves and to follow Jesus. Jeremiah would go on to say later that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. That's recorded in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. If it's desperately sick, no good can really come from following it. And the result of all of that, God says that I am bringing disaster upon them that they cannot escape. That's recorded in verse 11. And God says that the people of Judah have as many gods as towns, and as many altars for these foreign gods as there are streets in Jerusalem. They will cry out to these gods who cannot save them. That's recorded in verses 12 and 13. And then we see God command Jeremiah for the second time, "Do not pray for this people, because I will not listen." That's recorded in verse 14. The first time was back in chapter 7, verse 16. And he'll go on to tell Jeremiah that a third time in chapter 14, verse 11. Now, David wrote nearly 400 years earlier in Psalm 122 to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. "May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers." That's Psalm 122, verses 6 and 7. Well, you see, the key to Psalm 122 was "for those who love you." And this is an indication that there is virtually nobody left who truly loves the Lord. Now, we see a lot of similarities, as we've said before, between the condition of the hearts of the people in Jeremiah's day and our own. Why do we study the events of how people acted toward God from a country far away 2,600 years ago? Well, because it's so similar to our current time. There's very little in our daily life that's in common with the people at that time, but the condition of the human heart is very much the same. And despite that, we're fortunate that God hasn't commanded us to stop praying for our country because he will not listen, at least not yet. As believers in Christ, it's desperate that we do pray for the hearts and the minds of our countrymen and our leaders. And if you're part of the growing list of individuals that get this message who live outside of the United States, can you make a similar analogy to your country as well? Let me ask you a question. Whatever you pray for and whenever you pray, would you be willing to take a couple of extra minutes and ask that the Holy Spirit would move across the people and the leaders in your land in such a way that God's presence and love for them would be made known in a clear and unmistakable way? A way that causes them to realize that they need the presence of Jesus in their heart for the forgiveness of sin, for eternal life, and for that abundant life on earth that grows increasingly Christ-like. Would you be willing to take those extra couple of minutes every time you pray? Our world desperately needs it. Then God's perspective is summarized by saying, "The Lord once called you a green olive tree, beautiful with good fruit. But with the roar of a great tempest he will set fire to it, and its branches will be consumed. The Lord of hosts who planted you has decreed disaster against you, because of the evil that the house of Israel and the house of Judah have done, provoking me to anger by making offerings to Baal." That's recorded in verses 16 and 17. And God uses the same reference to himself, Jehovah Sabaoth, which we've seen before, as the Lord as warrior. We spoke about that in chapter 7. Jeremiah uses this name for God over 80 times. And the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, is mentioned as well as the house of Judah, the southern kingdom, as they both failed in much the same way, rebelling against God. And so we see Israel is referred to as an olive tree, and it's hard to overstate the importance of olives to Israel at this time. Olives are mentioned over 200 times in the Bible. In the parable of Jotham, the olive tree speaks and says gods and men are honored by my abundance. That's recorded in Judges chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. Olives are used for food, for lamp oil, for anointing oil, and medicine. The olive branch is the universal sign of peace, and the olive tree is a symbol of the relationship and the restoration of God. Its roots are deep, and it survives in harsh places, and it can live hundreds of years. And here the Lord is going to set it to fire, an image of the destruction as a result of hundreds of years of rebellion. And Paul picks up the illustration of Israel as an olive tree in Romans chapter 11, where he talks about some of the branches were broken off, but the Gentiles, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. That's recorded in Romans chapter 11, verse 17. Then, beginning in verse 18, we're told that the Lord revealed to Jeremiah that the men of Anathoth were planning to kill him because his message from the Lord was unpopular. It wasn't welcomed. And we have an expression today, when delivering bad news, it's not unusual to hear something like, "Hey, don't kill the messenger." Well, that's exactly what the men of Anathoth set out to do. They don't just reject Jeremiah's message, they plan to kill him. And there are three things to know and to understand about this. First of all, this is Jeremiah's hometown, so the people who set out to kill him are people that he grew up among and known all of his life. And second, Anathoth was one of the 13 priestly cities given to the descendants of Aaron. Anathoth isn't listed in the priestly cities in Joshua chapter 18, but it is included in the list in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 60. And let me ask you a question. What was the family business in Jeremiah's family? Well, they were priests. And the people who plan to kill him aren't just a bunch of thugs. This is the priestly line of Aaron, the leader of the nation. And all of the close friends of Jeremiah's father and his father before him, they were all priests. And third, those who seek to kill Jeremiah include his brothers and his own family. We're told that in chapter 12, verse 6, which is part of our study today. So if you summarize all of that, those who seek to kill Jeremiah, well, there are his neighbors, the religious leaders, and his own family. And Jeremiah goes on to say, upon reflection, "But I was like a gentle lamb led to slaughter. I did not know it was against me they devised schemes, saying, let us destroy the tree with its fruit. Let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name be remembered no more." That's in verse 19. The tree with its fruit is a reference to Jeremiah's life. And Jeremiah goes on to refer to Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord as a warrior, and says, "But O Lord of hosts, who judges righteously, who tests the heart and the mind, let me see your vengeance upon them, for to you have I committed my cause." That's in verses 20 and 21. And there's a couple of important points here. Jeremiah leaves the vengeance to God. Many of us in Jeremiah's shoes would hatch some kind of a plan to get them before they get us. Well, Jeremiah doesn't do that. Jeremiah doesn't just ask God to make them pay for their thoughts, but he qualifies his own position because he knows the human heart is wicked. He doesn't just ask God to take his side, but says in effect, deal with me and my heart as well as theirs. Don't just take my side, take the side of what's right in all of this. Because he's committed to the Lord, it's important to examine himself often. And God's reply to Jeremiah is that he will punish them in the time of their punishment in verse 22. It's a way of saying on his timetable. God says, "Vengeance is mine," a number of times in the Bible, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35 being one example. And Jeremiah acknowledges that first. And Jerusalem will soon be destroyed along with the nation of Judah. And there will be a remnant who is left who will go into captivity and come back to the land to reestablish the nation. But not so of the people of Anathoth. God promises that of them none will be left, including their sons and their daughters. And chapter 11 ends there and flows smoothly in thought into chapter 12. Okay, so let's pick up chapter 12 starting at verse 1. Righteous are you, O Lord, when I complain to you, yet I would plead my case before you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who are treacherous thrive? This is the voice of Jeremiah speaking to the Lord, and the first thing he acknowledges is that the Lord is righteous. The Lord is always in the right concerning all things, whether legal, social, religious, moral, whatever. And recall in chapter 2, God asks rhetorically, what wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me? Well, the answer in chapter 2 is the same as in chapter 12. There's nothing wrong with God. He's always in the right. He's always righteous. Now, the word that's translated here as complain means to plead or contend, as in a legal dispute. Jeremiah doesn't insinuate in any way that God's not righteous, that he's not my God, or that he's not the saving God of Israel and all mankind. But he is troubled by circumstances as he sees them. And the phrase, plead my case, means to discuss matters of justice or judgments. And having already conceded that the Lord is always in the right, no real legal complaint could be brought against God, but Jeremiah does have an issue of the right application of justice or judgment, and he wanted to talk to God about, namely, why do the wicked prosper? Now, the word that's translated as wicked here means morally wrong. He's speaking about a moral criminal. And there's wordplay here in the phrase that's translated as who are treacherous. In Hebrew, it's the two words bagad and beged. Bagad, beged. Say that 3 times fast. Bagad means to actively deal treacherously or deceitfully, and beged is a word that comes from the root word bagad, and it's most often translated as garment or clothes. You know how in a sporting event you can tell the players apart because one team is wearing white uniforms perhaps, and the other is wearing blue? Jeremiah describes people whose way or their lifestyle is characterized by being morally wrong and deceitful to such a degree that you can see it coming, as if they were wearing a uniform that identifies them as being treacherous. And his question is, why do people like that live prosperous and comfortable lives? Verse 2, you plant them, and they take root. They grow and produce fruit. You are near in their mouth and far from their heart. You see, the heart of the question here is that not only do these people prosper and enjoy a restful life, but you, God, you made them. You planted them, and you watched them grow faster and stronger than honest people. In Psalm 1, speaking of the righteous person, it says that he is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. That's Psalm 1, verses 3 and 4. Jeremiah is saying, I don't see the wicked being blown away like chaff. This is not the world I live in. The wicked grow and produce fruit the way Psalm 1 says that the righteous do. And the worst part about that is that they know of you, they talk about you, but their lifestyle doesn't reflect you. You are only words to them, nothing that really truly influences their life. Verse 3, but you, O Lord, know me, you see me, and test my heart toward you. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and set them apart for the day of slaughter. How long will the land mourn, and the grass of every field wither? For the evil of those who dwell in it, the beasts and the birds are swept away, because they said, he will not see our latter end. Jeremiah reminds God that he's examined Jeremiah's heart and sees and knows that I'm doing my best for you. And going back to verse 1, Jeremiah can say that you know that I know that you are righteous and that you are my God. He asked God to compare Jeremiah's heart towards God with the wicked, who hold God far from their heart. Now, when God revealed the plan by the men of Anathoth to kill him, Jeremiah said that he was like a lamb led to slaughter. Jeremiah still qualifies his own position because the Lord tests his heart but demands, it's an imperative in Hebrew, that God tears the treacherous away by force like sheep for the slaughter. Jeremiah essentially tells God to sick them. And the word that's translated as set them apart here is the word normally translated as sanctified. It means to be set apart as holy. Jeremiah commands God to establish a special holy day for their slaughter. And Jeremiah says God has this whole thing backwards. The wicked grow and prosper, but they should be experiencing punishment, and God doesn't seem to care about that. But you know my heart and my ways. You examine them all the time, and I'm the one suffering through the worst of intentions and from my fellow countrymen. This isn't fair, and it doesn't make any sense. Now, this issue of the wicked prospering is similar to the question of Job and Habakkuk, and David deals with it in Psalm 37, as Asaph does in Psalm 73. And a great many people who have lived their lives dedicated to God have struggled with this question all throughout history. And in verse 4, Jeremiah again accuses God of being indifferent to the effects of the sinful people. And recall in chapter 2 that the Lord said that the people have defiled my land spiritually, with great emphasis on the fact that the land belonged to God. And in chapter 7 we saw that the connection between the people and the land was so strong that when the people sinned, the land suffered. That seems to be what Jeremiah references here. And the phrase, he, speaking of God, he will not see our latter end, is a direct insult to God and his timelessness and his character. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 20, speaking of a rebellious generation, God said, I will hide my face from them, and I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness. The people may be saying that we're a perverse generation, sure, but God won't be around to do anything about it, so who cares? This almost sounds like a God is dead kind of a perspective, and Isaiah gives a different perspective by saying the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. That's recorded in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8. Now Amos makes a similar point, listing several physical difficulties that God struck upon the land that were designed to get the people to return to the Lord. He severely withheld rain, and he sent blight and mildew and locust and disease making the crops fail, and the people desperate for food and water. And he sent disease and military defeat in war on a scale not seen since the Egyptians suffered before the Exodus. This is all recorded in Amos chapter 4, verses 6 through 11. Let me ask you a question. What were the plagues in Egypt meant to do? Well, it was meant to make Pharaoh know that the God of creation is the God over everything. Pharaoh refused to accept that, and he suffered mightily because of it. And here some 850 years later, the Israelites, who benefited from all of that, now refuse to accept it. And the result of hardship God sent upon the Israelites was met with the same lack of awareness expressed by Pharaoh. Amos repeats the phrase, "You did not return to me," 5 times in verses 6 through 11. I withheld rain from you, and yet you did not return to me. I sent locusts, yet you did not return to me, and so on and so on. You see, they didn't make the association that the hardships they were suffering had a spiritual element to it. And in our lives, sometimes a lack of rain, figuratively speaking, is just a lack of rain. Sometimes that lack of rain may be because of our lifestyle and our treatment of God. So let me ask you a question. Is there something in your life suffering from a figurative lack of rain that might have a spiritual sense to it? It's something to give some thought to. And we see the Lord's response beginning in verse 5. If you have raced with men on foot, and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you are so trusting, what will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? For even your brothers in the house of your father, even they have dealt treacherously with you. They are in full cry after you. Do not believe them, though they speak friendly words to you. This is something of a you ain't seen nothing yet type of a response. The phrase translated here as men on foot is often used as a reference to soldiers on foot, or what we might call infantrymen in today's terms. And there's a couple of thoughts about what the men on foot and the horses might refer to. The men on foot might be the general disobedience that Jeremiah sees every day, and the horses might refer to the plot to kill him that includes his own family, which is in the next verse. And it might include the fact that today the men of Anathoth want to kill you, but it won't be long before all of Judah will want to kill you. Now J.A. Thompson applies the men on foot term to the false prophets that are around him. In a section about the lying prophets in Jeremiah chapter 23, God says, I did not send the prophets, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. God speaking about the false prophets here, and that's recorded in Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 21. Now, the same word translated as ran in chapter 23, verse 21, is translated as raced here in chapter 12, verse 5. And recall in chapter 2, God told Jeremiah to go to Jerusalem, and we believe Jeremiah was in his hometown of Anathoth at the time, some 3 or 4 miles away. The image here is of a prophet who would run to deliver an important message with a sense of urgency. And the idea may be that the false prophets, well, they've given you a good run, but there are still horses to deal with. And the horses may refer to the far greater level of deception that the false prophets have yet to say. And then again, the horses may also be a reference to the coming Babylonian army. God, speaking of the Babylonians, says, "Behold, he comes up like clouds, his chariots like the whirlwind, his horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are ruined." That's recorded in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 13. And he says something similar in chapter 8, verse 16. The Babylonian invasion would be a far more serious horse than the plot to kill him by the men of Anathoth. And in either event, God essentially says the difficulty you face now is just a preparation for far more difficult times ahead. Jeremiah is going to face all kinds of difficulties yet to come. Now, the phrase safe land is no doubt a play on words. Recall in chapter 7 that the people trusted in the presence of the temple in Jerusalem as their ultimate guarantee of safety. And it may be a play on the word Jerusalem. The word translated here as safe is the word shalom, meaning peace. And the name Jerusalem means the teaching of peace. And in either event, the land that once was safe and peaceful can no longer be considered that because the end is truly near. And in reality, it's much more like the thicket of the Jordan. The word translated as thicket means majesty or pride, which can be positive or negative. It may also be a reference to the coming Babylonian army. And we have to recall our context here. Jeremiah learns of the plot to kill him. He was the definition of trusting in the safe land of peace. And if not for God, his life would have been lost. And the message is clear. Be on guard and prepare for worse things to come. Recall that in Jeremiah's call in chapter 1, God tells Jeremiah 4 times that he will protect him. The call here is to stand guard. And in verse 6 here, we see that even his brothers and the house of his fathers, they deal treacherously with you. And we see the same word, bagad, used here for acting treacherously, as we saw in verse 1, meaning deceitfully. And to be in full cry after you means that they are essentially hunting him like an animal. Let me ask you a question. Have you known people who say nice things to you, but only want your harm? And most of us have, but we don't generally have the threat of death that Jeremiah is facing. Now, a wise man said in a meeting that I was in a number of years ago, when he was asked the question by a person why the unbelievers around him hate him because of his faith. And his answer was simply, well, what else would you expect? A dog's got a bark. We live in a fallen world, and bad things happen. Get used to it. You see, believers and unbelievers, well, we live shoulder to shoulder, and we live in a fallen world. So these things are going to happen. This kind of thing won't exist in heaven, but we're not there yet. This place is not our home. We're just traveling through. And in a sense, this is another run with foot soldiers and there being horses yet to come. The people who are in full cry against you, well, at least they're easy to identify who they are and how they feel. You can be prepared for them a little more easily. It's far more difficult with the people who openly speak friendly words to you, but secretly want to kill you. Verse 7, I have forsaken my house. I have abandoned my heritage. I have given the beloved of my soul into the hands of her enemies. My heritage has become to me like a lion in the forest. She has lifted up her voice against me. Therefore, I hate her. Now, this section represents God's answer to the question of why the wicked prosper. And J.A. Thompson points out that we don't see it in English, but verses 7 through 13 are written as a poem in a special format that highlights sadness and is common in the book of Lamentations. And the Net Bible describes these verbs as prophetic perfects, speaking of the future as if the action is already done. And God often refers to the future as if it's already done because to him it is. Now, the word house here refers to the people of the nation of Israel. It's been used to refer to the temple, but here it refers to the nation. And notice how the people are referred to here as God's house, his heritage, and the beloved of my soul, all of which have an element of ownership to it. God has great affection for them, even though they rebel. And because they rebel, notice the action items. He says, I have forsaken, abandoned, and given them over to the enemy. Jeremiah had asked God to sic them in verse 3. Here he says he leaves them and hands them over to her enemies. Now when he says, my heritage has become to me like a lion in the forest, the analogy of being like a lion is used more in Jeremiah than in any other book. And according to the Cleveland Zoo, lions roar primarily to warn that this is their territory and to exhibit strength and dominance. And the image here is that the people, the heritage of the Lord, roar against him to let him know that this is their territory and they will live as they see fit. They're in essence warning God to stay away and to stay out of their lives. Now we have to talk about the word that's translated here as hate. It's the word sonē, and it can have a wide range of motions and doesn't necessarily mean what our modern ears assumes that it means. It ranges from the most intense hatred that we would understand to the far more milder being set against, and that's the intention that's used here. It's used of Leah in Genesis chapter 29 verse 31 and in verse 33 to describe her as unloved by Jacob. And E.W. Buller describes love is used of the exercise of the greatest possible care for the object of the love. To hate can just mean the opposite of that, exercising less care. In Proverbs chapter 13 verse 24, it uses the same words, stating that whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Now, if you ask most of the parents of the time who spared the rod, most wouldn't describe why they do so because they hate their child the way we understand the word hate. The point of the writer is that the person who doesn't discipline the child isn't acting in the best interest of the child. God doesn't hate, and he doesn't not love anyone the way we understand those terms, but he can be set against those who rebel against him, and that's the sense in which this word is used. Now, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, well, that's a symbol that we see both in Genesis and in Revelation. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He's noble, the only one worthy to be praised. And here the nation of Judah in this time is compared to a lion who is roaring against God, trying to intimidate the creator of the universe, a challenge that they can only lose. Verse 9, Is my heritage to me like a hyena's lair? Are the birds of prey against her all around? Go, assemble all of the wild beasts, bring them to devour. Now the first part of this verse is difficult to translate. This is the only use of the word translated here as hyena. It can be taken as a participle, and in that sense it means to be variegated or many-colored. Or it can be taken as a noun, and in that sense it can be translated as hyena. And many Bible versions translate this as, Is my heritage a speckled bird? And in that view, the idea is that the nation is a proudly colored bird attracting predators to attack. And we see birds of one sort attack birds of another sort in nature, and that might be the picture here. And by the way, don't we as humans do that same kind of thing? Now, translating it as hyena gives the picture of birds of prey who are waiting to attack what is left over by the hyena. And in either event, the meaning is somewhat similar, that the nation has drawn the focus of all sorts of predators ready to devour. Verse 10, Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. They have made it a desolation. Desolate, it mourns to me. The whole land is made desolate, but no man lays it to heart. Now the phrase many shepherds here refers to many rulers. Some believe this to refer to the rulers within the country, others as perhaps rulers of the foreign countries. Now I think the condemnation throughout the book of Jeremiah is far more concerned with the people and the leadership inside the nation, so I go along with the reference being to the leaders inside the nation. And the vineyard is a symbol of the nation and the people. Israel is God's vine and the land is a vineyard. They're very common illustrations in the Bible. And here God refers to his people as a pleasant field. As in verse 7, God here describes the nation as he does there with a sense of ownership of something very desirable that has become ruined. Now notice the word desolate is used 3 times here. As we said in our study in chapter 7, repeating something 3 times gives the sense that the people have been made infinitely desolate, and nobody cares. The language is of completeness and finality. Now the phrase that's translated as they have made it is in Hebrew the same word translated as lay near the end. In the original Hebrew, this states something like they lay it to waste, but they don't lay it to heart. And there's a great contrast here between the sense of loss and the sorrow of the Lord over the land and of the people who just don't seem to notice or to care. Verse 12, upon all the bare heights in the desert destroyers have come, for the sword of the Lord devours from one end of the land to the other. No flesh has peace. They have sown wheat and have reaped thorns. They have tired themselves out, but profit nothing. They shall be ashamed of their harvests because of the fierce anger of the Lord. Now what appears to be foreign invaders are actually the sword of the Lord, bringing justice as a result of hundreds of years of rebellion. And no place will escape judgment, not even the barest of places in the wilderness. When the Lord acts in judgment, there will be no peace for anyone destined for judgment. Now Habakkuk was active as a prophet during the later part of Jeremiah's time, and when he learned of the coming judgment, Habakkuk prayed to God, saying, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. That's recorded in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. Habakkuk was given a vision of how awful this was going to be, and he asked the Lord to remember mercy. Now in verse 13, they've sown wheat and reaped thorns. Foreign armies often depended on the crops and the livestock in the land that they were invading, and they destroyed whatever was left over, and that might be the intended picture here. They sowed wheat expecting a harvest, but it was interrupted by the siege that is to come. They will end up with nothing. And recall that the concept of worthlessness, it's a common refrain in the book of Jeremiah. And we see here that all of this is because of the anger of the Lord, and all of that is because of their rebellion from the Lord. Okay, well, we'll just summarize the rest of Jeremiah chapter 12. In verses 14 through 17, God refers to the nations who have attacked Israel over the years, some of whom he's used to humble Israel, as evil. And it seems pretty clear that God uses evil people to accomplish his plans at times. But in the end, he will pull them, the evil nations who have attacked Israel, out of their land and pull Judah from them and show mercy on Judah and bring them back to God's holy land. God's ultimate purpose was to show mercy for the remnant that is left. And we even see that mercy extends to the nations outside of Judah. And we see a duplicate use of the word lama, which means to learn. We're told that if they will lamed, which is translated as diligently learn the ways of the Lord, they shall be established as the Lord's people. That's an incredible promise and consistent with the message of the Bible that Israel was to be a light to the Gentiles so that they would come to the Lord. And if they don't, well, they'll be destroyed. And chapters 11 and 12 are filled with hard messages, but it ends on a message filled with hope. Okay, well, let's go ahead and summarize here. First, what was the answer to the question? The question was, why do the wicked prosper and live peaceful lives? Well, I think the question was answered before the question was asked. At the end of chapter 11, we touched on this. God says, I will punish them in the year of their punishment. That was told to us in chapter 11, verses 22 and 23. You see, he was talking about the men of Anathoth there, but isn't that the answer more universally? As Christians, we know that there's going to be a day of judgment. If you've read the back of the book, you know that, and you know the wicked will meet a terrible end. God works on his timetable, not ours. And we also touched on Asaph, who wrote Psalm 73. He also struggled with this issue. For the first 15 verses, he describes the privilege that the wicked enjoy. Then he says, when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I discerned their end. That's in Psalm 73, verses 16 and 17. He goes on to describe them as being destroyed in a moment in verse 19. God gave him a revelation-type experience, a back-of-the-book type of experience. Asaph then goes on to say, whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire beside you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That's in verses 25 and 26. You see, Asaph comes to understand that this life isn't about why the wicked prosper. This life is about one singular desire, God in heaven, and nothing else matters because he's seen what happens to those who don't have that. And God's reply to Jeremiah's question is really more of an explanation than an answer. And you can hear the love of his people in his words. He describes them as the beloved of my soul in verse 7. Let me ask you a question. Do you know that you're the beloved of God's soul? That's an amazing description, and it comes from God himself. The problem is that they've become like a proud lion who roars in the face of God as if to chase him away. How did they get that way? Well, many shepherds, we might say many influencers, they led them astray. And what's the result of that? Well, the destroyer will come, and none will be missed. That sounds a lot like the back of the book, doesn't it? You see, God has his timeline where all things will be judged. And we're not on the program committee, we're on the invitation committee. Paul told Timothy, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." That's recorded in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And man, don't we see that in our world today? And we know, because of the back of the book, that there will be an end to human history as we know it. And second, I don't know what you're going through at the moment. I know there are a lot of believers in Jesus who are sailing along quite nicely and all is well, and that's great. I also know there is a lot of believers in Jesus who are suffering through all kinds of things. Conflicts with people that they love, health issues, financial difficulties, the list just goes on. What if God's message to you at this moment is that you've only run with foot soldiers so far and the horses are yet to come? God may be saying that you have to live in my strength for what I have for you today, because I have bigger plans for you, and learning to live in my strength now will prepare you for what comes next. And for sure, something is coming next. Paul told Timothy, "As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry." That's in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 5. Well, third, the logical follow-up question to that is, what's your ministry? You see, we know that there will be difficulty in this life. Jesus told us that. Whatever your ministry is, you can't go it alone. God has a plan for you. The question is, do you know what it is? Nowhere does God tell us to just go to work every day and see what happens. God wants you to be involved in his work. And for the people of Judah, the very real message was that the end is now very near. It can't be stopped, and it can't be changed. And again, the back of the book tells us the same thing. The message for us in our day can't be any different. And finally, if you're not a believer in Jesus for the forgiveness of sin, this message should rattle you just a little bit. There's only two ends to this life: life with Jesus in heaven, and the kind of end that has been described in today's lesson, a terrible one. One of the reasons we put all of this together every week is to encourage you to consider the alternative in the abundant life of knowing Jesus as Savior. And my prayer is that this day you would accept his offer to become the beloved of his soul. And if you'd like to know more about putting your faith in Jesus for the forgiveness of sin, you can reach out to us at the link below. We'd be happy to talk with you about that. And that's the message that I have for us from Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 1 through 13. And I look forward to our next time together.